Second speaker, Kim Reynolds, is well known to most of you in the room, of course, because he is professor in our School of Community and Global Health. Kim leads several projects, including one titled Habitual and Neurocognitive Processes in the Prevention of Adolescent Obesity, funded by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and Obesity Prevention Tailored for Health, which is funded by the National Cancer Institute. His research interests include the development and evaluation of community and family-based interventions focusing on nutrition, physical activity, and obesity. His talk today on trail characteristics as correlates of urban trail use addresses the influence of the built environment on physical activity and risk for obesity.
Well, good morning. It's still morning, not quite afternoon. It's good to be able to follow Randall because I think part of what I'm going to talk about today is hopefully research that can generate information that will be useful in making the kinds of decisions for design of the built environment that are necessary to, I think, reinvent our built environment and make it conducive to the conduct of physical activity and reduce consumption of high-fat foods, etc., as a means of reducing chronic disease rates. As Larry mentioned, the work I'm going to talk about is some work that we've been doing over the past several years, and hopefully we'll do more in the future, looking at trail characteristics, their association with physical activity, and also trail utilization. The work I'll talk about today was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and as part of this active living research initiative that, again, Randall made mention of some of this work in his talk. This was a partnership with a number of different researchers, and it's interesting to do work in this area because you work with very diverse teams. We came with a public health perspective. We worked with urban planners like Bill Fulton, and also people in geography like Jennifer Walsh. So why look at trails? Why be interested in research on trails and their utilization? I think there are several reasons. One is I mentioned that trails might be a useful way to modify our built environment, to increase physical activity, and reduce risk for chronic disease. So the relationship to physical activity is definitely a tie-in here, both recreational and even transportation related physical activity. I think trails also bring other potential benefits. They certainly provide access to nature, can improve quality of life. They even in some cases have a historic preservation benefit. For example, the Minuteman Trail in Boston is laid out right along the route from Lexington to back to Boston that the early patriots took when they had fought the British and then retreated to Boston. So there's some historic benefit too to preserving trails and creating trails. They're also currently available in our cities and our urban areas, so they do provide access for physical activity. The Rails to Trails Conservancy estimates that there are something like 15,000 miles of trails that exist in the country now. At any one time, there's something like 1,100 trail conversion projects, trail construction projects that are ongoing. There has been work done in the past on trail utilization and correlates of trail use. They've tended to show some emerging characteristics or robust correlates and predictors. Certainly distance to trail and barriers to access to the trails tend to be clearly and consistently associated. Obviously, the greater the distance, the less likely people are to use trails. The greater the number of barriers. More recently, people have begun looking at the communities adjacent to trails and factors that might facilitate trail use by looking at those community-adjacent characteristics. Things like connectivity, the more interconnected the neighborhoods are surrounding the trail, the more likely people are to access and use the trail. And then there are these individual level characteristics that have been associated with trail use, again, consistently over time. Things like age. Trails are clearly used by people that are young adults and middle age. And Young people, children and adolescents tend not to utilize trails, and elderly people don't utilize trails, and that's found over and over again. Education and income are related, so people with higher incomes, higher education tend to use trails, and they're predominantly used by males, although not exclusively. There's a slight preponderance of use by men and not women. What else needs to be researched in terms of trails and their use? Well, there are a lot of things. There really isn't a very big support base in the literature for understanding things like design of trails and how those are related to physical activity, or even the extent to which trails are used. So are aesthetics really critically important? Are features like obstacles on trails, where they're sited, these are important features that have been understudied. Even factors such as, or questions like, how are trails causally related to levels of physical activity? That really hasn't been nailed down. We suspect that they are, but some of the experimental and methodological issues involved in evaluating that question are pretty difficult. Other issues emerge, like the question of use of the trails by children and also ethnic and racial minority groups. We need to know more about use patterns among these groups and how we can promote use of trails to these subpopulations. So the elements of the research that we conducted were several. One was selecting the trails that we would study. And this initial funding cycle, we had 3 trails that we studied. I'll talk more about those in just a minute. We, as a first step after selecting the trails, went out to each trail and did a trail count. So we wanted to establish some sense of the pattern of usage, the amount of usage on each of these trails. Again, I'll talk more about that in a moment. We audited each trail, so we walked the length of each trail, and we systematically coded the design features of the trail and the environment that was immediately adjacent to the trail. So now I'm not talking about going back a mile or 2 into the community. I'm talking about just what you can see from the trail. So we wanted to know the exact characteristics of each of the trails that we were dealing with and that we were conducting research on. We also did GIS characterization of the neighborhoods around the trails. And as a part of our research, and this was actually central to everything that we did, everything I've talked about so far, and the data that we collected, we segmented these trails into half-mile increments. And then we looked at a buffer area that was 1 mile on either side of the trail. And that's where we used geographic information systems to characterize those neighborhoods that were in those 1-mile buffers. And then things like coding, the auditing of the characteristics of the trails, we did those in half-mile segments. Same thing with the trail count. Counts pertain to each of those half-mile segments. And that's how we could just divide these longer trails up, create units of analysis, if you will, for the research, and look at some of these variables to see if they're associated with physical activity and trail utilization. The last thing we did, and I'm not going to talk about this today, it'll be coming out in future papers and hopefully be disseminated to audiences beyond academia, as Randall was recommending. But we did a random sample survey of the residents in these buffer areas, the 1-mile buffer on either side of the trail. We randomly sampled about 500 residents and looked at their perceptions as well as their individual trail use. And what this data set does allows us to look at all these different levels of trail influence. Audit of the trail features, the neighborhoods surrounding the trail, and then actual individual reports. This is a big effort, so as I mentioned, I'm only going to talk really about the first 3 things here, the selection, the count, and the trail audit, and some of the work we've done linking the trail audit to the trail count data. So trail selection, it sounds easy. You go find trails, you look on the map, see where they are, you go do research on them, but it was a lot more complicated than that. Partly because we had very specific criteria that we were trying to address in selecting our trails. We knew that they needed to be continuous, so they weren't broken by major street arteries and would start and then stop for 3 miles and then start again under the same name. these needed to be continuous. Someone could start at one end and walk through to the other end. They needed to be multi-use, so cyclists could use them, walkers, joggers, etc. And they need to be at least 15 miles in length. And the last one is really the kicker, because it's hard to find trails, believe it or not, that have these other characteristics that go continuously for 15 miles unbroken. We want to select them from different regions of the country, so we'd have climatic and regional influences that would be modeled in this research. Urban and suburban settings. And then we also were really keen on addressing some of the deficits in prior literature. So making sure that these trails ran through neighborhoods of different racial and ethnic representation. So we deliberately targeted Hispanic, African American, European American neighborhoods. Tried to make sure every trail we worked with would go through at least 2 of those neighborhoods. I'll skip some of this detail. Just suffice it to say that we, through website searches, interviews with various people that do work in this area around the country, we looked at about 1,000 trails and came up with 3 that we selected. The first was the Chicago Lakefront Trail, and this is just a gorgeous trail that runs along Lake Michigan. If you've ever been to Chicago down on the lakefront, you've probably run across this trail. Goes for about 15 miles. The center of it is right about the Loop downtown. This is one of the days when it's really great, or one of the reasons it's really great to be a trails researcher, because we were there in the summer. It was gorgeous. We got to walk on this trail for 4 or 5 days. It was just really wonderful. The second trail we used was the Dallas White Rock Lake Trail. Whereas the Chicago Trail is clearly at least centered in a very urban area, Dallas was much more in a suburban area in northeast Dallas. It had about half of the trail around a big lake, recreational lake, and then trailed off into the neighborhoods to the northwest. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up here. Then we did the LA River Trail, which was clearly, in a sense, the most urban. I suppose it's not more urban than Chicago, but it sure felt like it when you're down there. So much grittier, I would say. And it ran from just south of downtown LA, around Bell Gardens, Bell, down through areas like Compton on one side, Claremont on the other, and went down to Long Beach Harbor. It kind of skirted along the coast right there. Okay. I want to talk about the trail count. So what we did was to go to each trail, take a team, and count trail use for 2 weekend days and 2 weekdays. We tried to code systematically the age, gender, and type of use of each trail. And so we would station data collectors at the demarcation points for these boundaries, these half-mile segments of trail. They would be trained up, trained to criteria, there'd be good agreements between the raters, and then 2 raters would code everybody that came down the trail. Generally, that's a very doable process. It gets a little hairy sometimes when you've got a very busy trail, a beautiful Saturday, and you've got hundreds of people flying by. It can be tricky to get all these people coded adequately. Another challenge to doing this work is marking these boundaries. We would walk the trails the day before we did any of this trail count. We'd put tape where the boundaries to the trail segments were, and we put little flags. And the flags disappear with surprising regularity. They come along, I don't know if they're collecting them as souvenirs or exactly what it was. And we put tape down, and that was a little bit more enduring, but people would take that also. So we got to the point where, we always had a GPS in the field, and we could go along and verify the location of the boundaries using a GPS. Oh, I'm almost out of time. It's one of our, I won't go back. Oh, there it is. This is a faithful data collector doing a trail count. Just quickly what we found from these trail counts. We counted almost 18,000 users across the trails. The most used in Chicago, second in Dallas, distant third was Los Angeles. Replicating the literature, we found that our users were predominantly male. The 2 ends of the age spectrum fell away. And we found predominantly cyclists and then joggers and walkers in addition. I'm going to talk briefly about the trail audit, and then I want to show you my data tables, and then I'll be over time. The audit, as I mentioned, is a systematic coding of trail characteristics. We used, at the time there was no trail audit instruments, we had to develop our own. So we used something that was developed in Australia for coding streets and what's happening, with a built environment of the street. And we had 2 auditors who walked each trail. I was one of those. And we had a collaborator who's since gone to Australia and taken a job, Jason Byrne, who did the other audit. The audits would hit a number of features. One was the building structures. So what is the predominant built structure in terms of buildings? Was it apartments, institutional buildings like hospitals and schools? We coded characteristics of the trails themselves. Were they flat or steep? Were they in good condition, terrible condition? Did they bifurcate? Were they easy to navigate? We coded aesthetics. Was it aesthetically pleasing for a walker, for cyclists, even for somebody riding a horse? What was the vegetation like? Was it noisy? Were there odors? And finally, we coded characteristics of the area just immediately adjacent to the trail. So things like street lights, etc. Views was another factor that we coded. So we had a very good, we had many variables, we had a very good sense of what these trails look like. And what we did was relate these trail audit features to the count data. We had a lot of trail audit variables, so we allocated those to 8 different categories, and we looked for predictors from within the categories, so we weren't totally capitalizing on chance. And in the interest of time, I won't go through each of these in detail because I've already hit 0. But I'll say that there are a few aesthetic features like litter and noise were inversely associated with use. Maybe not surprisingly, what may be a little surprising is the magnitude. So for example, a very noisy section versus a section with no noise, you might have a decrement as much as 47% in use. That's what our models estimated. Another interesting thing was that natural views, which you'd think would have more use, a segment with a natural view, because that's aesthetically pleasing. We didn't find that. We found that mixed and urban views were segments that had more use. So why is that? Well, one possible reason is that maybe access to those trail points is greater in a mixed and urban view area than a natural area. Natural areas, by definition, may have fewer points where you can get onto the trail. It could be that the land use mix is better around urban and mixed use areas. In natural areas, you don't have stores that people would be heading to, or movie theaters or other uses, so they're not going to use the trail to get to other locations. And then maybe urban dwellers just like an urban view. That's another theory. Let me note one other thing that's kind of interesting on this first table, which is that also maybe counterintuitive. The denser the vegetation was, the lower was use. Again, aesthetically, that's counterintuitive. You think more vegetation, people are going to want to use that segment more. But we thought maybe this was a safety issue, that people felt that they couldn't be seen on the trail, they could be more easily assaulted in sections where the density was heavy. And then my only other data table. Trail condition, not surprisingly, positively related to use, but it's in really good shape. And let me just note, I mentioned the natural features issue. I mentioned also the trailside facilities. That tend to be positively related to use, particularly cafes, but we had an index of other trailside features like storage for bicycles, restrooms, etc. The more of those features that were present, the greater trail use on that segment. For something like cafes, it's hard to know if that's causal because people may cite cafes where trail use is heavy. Or the cafe may be drawing more trail users, you're not sure. So just very quick summary. Of the 8 categories, we found significant association for 7 of them. Continuity and navigation, interestingly, had no effect. We think that's because the trails were all easy to navigate. We verified that on the ground by walking them, and it was definitely true. Features that diminish aesthetic appeal, fairly, makes sense they diminish trail use. things that boost perceived safety will increase use. And finally, trail site characteristics increase use. And this just shows you that you can build trails. It doesn't mean people will be physically active. So promotion is definitely an issue as well. So, and that's it for me.